Welcome to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. This is episode number 702. My name is Camden Busey. I'm here in Grayslake, Illinois, at the Reformed Forum studio. And I've got a great conversation lined up for you today. It's a pre-recorded conversation, but one that I've been looking forward to quite some time. I had on the program Dr. Stephen J. Nichols. Of course, Dr. Nichols has been on the program before, and I'll put links to some of his episodes in our podcast description there. Dr. Nichols serves as the president of Reformation Bible College and chief academic officer of Ligonier Ministries. He's written over 20 books. He's the editor of the Theologians on the Christian Life series, and he also hosts a weekly podcast, 5 Minutes in Church History. Many of you know Dr. Nichols, of course. And we welcomed him to the program to speak about the very first biography of the life and the ministry of Dr. R.C. Sproul. Of course, Dr. Sproul, does he need any introduction from, or at least to our audience? I imagine most of you, if not every single one of you, has in one way, shape, or form been influenced by Dr. Sproul directly, by his books, by his teaching series, maybe by meeting him and through personal interaction. And if you haven't, then you certainly have been influenced by him secondarily, because his influence and his work, the Lord worked through him in many ways to pave a path forward for so many other Reformed people, especially in the United States, but throughout the world. Reading here from the biography information from Crossway. Of course, R.C. Sproul, 1939 to 2017, was a pastor, a professor, an author, and the founder and president of Ligonier Ministries. His contributions in the areas of biblical studies, theology, worldview and culture, Christian living, and church history continue to be held in high regard. In this book, Stephen J. Nichols offers an in-depth look at Sproul's life and ministry, his childhood, his formative seminary education, his marriage and partnership with his beloved wife, Vesta, his influence on broader American evangelicalism, and his many friendships with key figures such as James Montgomery Boyce, John MacArthur, John Piper, J.I. Packer, and Chuck Colson. This biography details the profound impact Sproul had on the lives of many during his lifetime and highlights the various ways his legacy continues to influence countless pastors and students worldwide. The book is a tremendous book, lengthy. It's almost pushing 400 pages, and it covers all aspects and varieties of Dr. Sproul's life, and gets into not only his childhood, his early upbringing, his own education, but it also gets into several theological issues and controversies, things that he was involved in. It speaks quite extensively about his work in the doctrine of inerrancy. It speaks about his view of classical apologetics and interaction with evidentialists and with presuppositionalists. It speaks about, of course, the holiness of God, and, of course, talking about the many different institutions that Dr. Sproul helped to found and helped to build and to lead throughout his life that continue on today, including Ligonier Ministries and all of the different aspects that Ligonier is involved with, like the radio program Renewing Your Mind, and all the publishing, Table Talk, the newsletter / magazine, Reformation Bible College, New St. Andrew's Chapel, you name it. There's so much to discuss, and it's all in the book. And so we take a bit of time now to speak with Dr. Stephen J. Nichols about this biography, so enjoy. Steve, it's such a pleasure to have you. It's been we've had you on the program before, and we talked about a bunch of stuff, even the blues. I'm learning some.
Yes. I remember that.
Yeah, your wonderful book on the blues, and I'll put links to all that stuff in the episode description. But today we're talking about R.C. Sproul, a life. Everything. Well, so much of what we do here at Reformed Forum is in one way, shape, or form been influenced or made possible by R.C.'s ministry and the ways in which God worked through him and Ligonier, paving a way for many in regards really kind of like a Reformation revolution in our country. And it's been just us kind of tagging along in the wake. And I was so happy to see that you had written this biography and that Crossway had published it. And I'm excited to talk to you today about it. I wanted to just open things up, Steve, and just ask a bit about your own personal experience with R.C. and how did you come to know him, either from a distance, and then eventually in person?
Yeah, so the first time I met RC I was in college. He was speaking at the Philadelphia Conference on Reformed Theologies back then with his foxhole buddy, Jim Boyce, friend of mine. We were standing in line to get our book signed, like everybody does. And my friend said to Dr. Sproul, Dr. Sproul, by any chance, will you be speaking in New Jersey anytime soon?
Yeah.
And Dr. Sproul looks up at him and says, boy, or no, doesn't say boy, he says, son, if I will be in New Jersey, it won't be by chance. And so now it's my turn next. I just sheepishly push the book aside and, move on. But years later, I was invited down here to speak. This was 2010. And Carl Truman and I were invited down to speak for a winter conference. So we gladly escaped Philadelphia winter and came to Florida, had dinner with RC. And, I'm like cramming theological dictionaries. I'm just thinking, preparing for any question he's going to. It's the opposite. It's tell me about your kids. Oh, you have a dog. And then it's off to the races about dogs. And then just in God's kindness and good providence, brought my family down here to work for Ligonier here at the college, and ended up just being able to be around Dr. Sproul in what turned out to be those twilight years of his life. And as you mentioned, you sort of alluded to just your debt to him. I'll just be forever grateful for those opportunities I had to be around RC. And so just truly grateful for that experience.
Praise the Lord. Yeah, I only met Dr. Sproul once in person. It was at a book signing, but it was forever memorable. And even just the little passing moment, very thankful for him. Of course, had much more experience reading his books and being influenced in that regard and seeing him speak at conferences. And it was so helpful for me to kind of put myself on some confessional and Reformed rails, because I grew up in a Presbyterian church, but it was mainline. So I find a connection with Dr. Sproul because I was born into the UPC USA, the church where the denomination he was ordained into. Yeah. And in many ways have that similar experience of, a liberalizing church and then leaving it to go on to more confessional pastures. But I'm curious about the process of you writing this book, but you also had some really extensive opportunities to interview Dr. Sproul yourself and speak to him about many of these aspects of his life. What was that like? What kinds of things did you learn? What struck you the most in your personal interaction?
Well, the things you know about him, but then what happens is as you get into it, you realize, no, you only knew one dimension of what you thought you knew about him. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the relationship with Vesta, everybody knows it's RC and Vesta, but as you get into the story, you realize, wow, his life is basically a love story with RC and Vesta, and it's just a beautiful story. I was able to spend time with him. We go over to his home and just record sessions with him, talking about his life. After he passed away, I was able to spend time with Vesta. You mentioned about your own sort of tradition and being in this liberal world. She said that was the best thing for RC because he basically had two educations, both in college and seminary. He had the education from the liberals, and then he had to independently sort of construct his own education from the conservatives. And she felt like that was part of the genius of his ministry, and also gave him a real compassion for people to just teach them the truth. I think it's just a lot of what we thought about RC. I just learned even more. I will say one of the things that I probably enjoyed learning the most was to see all of the foundation work that went into the RC we know.
Yeah.
So he can walk up to a lectern. No, I've seen him do this. On the way up to the pulpit, grab somebody's Bible. They're sitting in the front row, and he just grabs their Bible, takes it up with him into the pulpit. So, he's got no notes, and just pitch perfect elegance comes out. And you think, where'd all this come from? And you go back and you see, through the 60s, through the early 70s, it was feet under the desk, piles of books, notebooks full of notes. You just really saw the foundation, the faithful foundation building that then becomes all the books, all the teaching series, all the preaching.
Yeah, I think that that's something that a lot of Americans especially don't understand, that typically find it more in Eastern cultures where we tend to prize talent and natural ability.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true. God does provide. And Dr. Sproul was tremendously gifted by the Lord.
And
Praise
he
the
had
Lord.
that. That's right. He had natural gifts.
But he also put in the work. And I love your little descriptions, even at times in the biography, of just reading through his marginalia and the development of that through time, and how he digested books and learned with purpose, and all of that is there and present, but it's not, you don't always see it. And that's also the gift of a great teacher. He doesn't need to bring the pots and pans when he's delivering you dinner. You know all that stuff happened,
right.
but you don't have to see
all the
all.
ingredients.
Right, right. Praise the Lord. Looking back into Dr. Sproul's early days, born in 1939, it's interesting to set the stage in Pittsburgh, because he is a son of Pittsburgh in many ways. Loved it dearly. Every pothole you mentioned. Speak to me about his family and the family business, and just what was his childhood like growing up in Pittsburgh? How did that form him in those early years?
I mean, this is another era. So he's born in 39. His dad was an accountant. His dad was an accountant. His uncle was an accountant. R.C. Sproul and Sons. The accounting firm was in downtown Pittsburgh. The building was later torn down, and on its site was built the massive United States Steel Tower.
Yeah.
So you can't get any more downtown Pittsburgh than that. They lived 10 miles away in this little place called Pleasant Hills. It truly was pleasant, and it truly was hills. And this was RC's world. There's the drugstore with the soda fountain and the soda jerk. There's the Saturday afternoon matinees. This was his world. But his dad, well past draft age, volunteered and went to the war. So his early years, his father's an accountant in the army, but he's in Italy, Morocco, and then Italy. When his dad comes home, it's Leave It to Beaver. It's the 50s, and RC's all sports, and that's his whole life. And it's every sport: hockey, basketball, baseball. He says his favorite sport to play was hockey, but the sport he was most skillful at was baseball. He ended up getting a baseball scholarship to University of Pittsburgh, but he turned it down to go to Westminster College for an athletic scholarship. When he was a teenager too, his father had a serious stroke, debilitating stroke. RC would talk about carrying him fireman style from his bed to the chair in the living room, from the chair in the living room to the dinner table. But even with a stroke, his father would come to the dinner table with a crisp white shirt on and tie.
A different era. Yeah.
Yeah, and then RC's father died when RC was a teenager, and so of course that's going to have an impact on him. He loved his dad, and his dad was his hero. And through all this time, RC's not converted. He's in church, but it's a liberal church. He's singing in the choir. Church is down the street, and at the end of his street, it's not even a half a mile walk. And of course, there's Vesta. Her house was a half mile the other way from the church. So really, his whole world was contained right there in Pleasant Hills. Then as he goes off to college, his freshman year, he's converted. And then, as they say, the rest is history. But yeah, that was the 40s and 50s. That was RC's life. I mean, this is the big cars with lots of chrome. It's the whole package.
And a lot of days at Forbes Field too, both Steelers and
Forbes Field. He
Pirates.
Was there when Roberto Clemente stepped out on the field for the first time as a Pittsburgh Pirate. And
even he invested there when Bill Mazeroski won the World Series of the Homer. It's pretty amazing.
It was, it was the same year they got married, and I'm not sure which which event meant. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
I'm sure his marriage was more exciting, but
sure.
that was,
Good to
what a
have the
year
two.
for the Pirates to win the World Series in Game 7 at home.
Yeah, it's so important to understand the family heritage. There's something even more profound and deeper that, if I'm not mistaken, his family early on were Methodists, but then a Presbyterian church was put up nearby, and they started attending that. But it wasn't necessarily, didn't seem to me, out of doctrinal concerns or reasons that they started to attend. But regardless, R.C.'s family came to be Presbyterians. But when you dig into his family history through the Sprouls, you find a very rich Reformed tradition going all the way back to John Knox and Sproul's
and RC
ancestor.
loved that, of course.
But it's interesting to see how in God's providence he works these things out and then raises up Dr. Sproul in a particular way to, in a sense, kind of carry on the ministry of his forefather, who was the first minister ordained in Scotland, if I'm not mistaken, by John Knox, I think eventually sent to Ireland.
Absolutely. And his initials were R.C. Sproul.
I know.
And
you can't write this
isn't
stuff.
That great? But, so here we have two things, Camden, we just stumbled upon this great historical connection to John Knox and Scottish Presbyterianism and Reformation. But I think the other thing that you just let the cat out of the bag here, this may be the scandal of 20th century Reformed thought that R.C. Sproul was baptized as an infant in a Methodist church.
Right.
So we may have found the scandal.
Well, I married a Methodist, so Gerhardus Voss did
There's
too.
There's hope
so,
for all of us then, I guess.
Yeah, it can work. We can work it out. How did RC end up? Well, there's so much to say. We have about 400 pages of this book, and for the brief moment, we obviously can't get into everything. That's why people need to read the book. And the love story between RC and Vesta is just heartwarming. How can you not love that? How he met her in first grade, she in second, and then that carries on all the way through their lives. But let's speak a bit about his conversion there at Westminster College, and then also his second conversion. And we're not talking charismaticism here, but explain that. And what did he mean by, talk about those two moments and how that set the stage for later ministry.
So he would say he was probably the only person in church history converted by Ecclesiastes 11:3. Right. And right now your listeners are saying,
what verse
Ecclesiastes
is that?
11:3. I don't think I know what that verse is.
Right.
It's if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? That's not the verse. But it's if a tree falls in the woods, whether it falls to the north or the south, there it lies. Well, here's what happened. RC was in his dorm. He was going to go to Youngstown, Ohio, because the bars in Youngstown didn't check IDs.
Right.
And on his way, he stops at the Lucky Strikes machine to get a pack of cigarettes going out the door. And as he reaches down to pull the cigarettes out of the bottom, he looks over and he sees two seniors who are leaders of the football team. And they motion RC to come over to him. So of course he's going to go. He's a freshman and he's on the football team and he's going to go to these upperclassmen. And they're sitting over a Bible, open Bibles. And they say, hey, we're having a Bible study and we're reading this verse. And they read to him Ecclesiastes 11:3. RC goes back to his dorm room, spends a couple hours in prayer, pleading for God's mercy to save him, because he said, I saw myself as that dead tree rotting in the woods and dead in my sin. And he pleads for God's mercy. And that's his conversion in 1961. I mean, 1957. I mean, it's just an amazing story. Well, then about a year later, it's winter. He can't sleep. He says he feels summoned. He writes about this, opening pages of Holiness of God, but much better than I can retell it. Makes the midnight walk to the chapel there on the campus of Westminster College, drawn right through the Gothic doors under the oaken doors under a Gothic arch of the chapel, through the nave and right to the front. And he's overwhelmed with the sense of the holiness of God. And he called it his second conversion. But, the thing to me about it was, we all think of RC, we've been talking about his family life and just his personal life, sports. It's the theology of RC that drew us in, draws us in. And primarily, it's the doctrine of God that draws us in.
Yeah.
And primarily, it's the holiness of God. mean, this is his hallmark. And you see it right from the beginning of his conversion. He said this often, Camden, you find it in his books. He would say it often. When he first was converted and he read the Bible through for the first time, really, he came to this realization that this is a God who plays for keeps. And I think that was right there out of the gate of his Christian life and ministry. And he never wavered from it. He never really moved off of that as his emphasis.
Yeah, I picked up on that thread, and it's more than a thread. It's a foundational piece of the biography, that emphasis on classic theism, just orthodox theology, right, and how central and foundational that is. If we don't have that, we don't have anything. And that was so tremendously helpful for me in my life, and it's so helpful for other people who are encountering Calvinism and Reformed doctrines and having a difficult time. Often it's because we have an elevated view of man and a reduced view of God. We don't understand our sin and God's holiness. And when you start to understand who God is as he is revealed to us, and who we are in relation to him as sinners under his wrath and curse, things start to fall into place. And to see that firm emphasis on orthodox, confessional, classical theism, and then also his willingness from experience to fight and to maintain those things, across a whole wide range of institutions, thinking about Ligonier, the church, St. Andrews, Reformation Bible College, Radio Ministries, you name it. You see a really wonderful portrait of a servant of the Lord.
I mentioned we had these biography sessions where I go to his house. The last one I did with him was October of 2017. After that one, I recorded it. We did a podcast called Open Book, and I did a season of that with RC. We did a couple of those afterwards. He passed away, of course, in December. But the last session was in October. And we've been going through year by year pretty much. But I felt like I want to do something different that session. And I sat down with him and I said, okay, let's break out of the year by year thing. What are you? Are you a Reformed classical theist? And I mean, eyes lit up, sits on the edge of his chair. Absolutely. That's all I've wanted to do. That's all I've been. And he starts with Aristotle.
Yeah.
And pure being. Mm-hmm. And then he moves to Augustine. Then he moves to Aquinas. Then he moves to Calvin, who's trained as a scholastic. Mm-hmm. And he moves to Turretin. And he moves to Edwards. And he says, this is all I've wanted to do. Mm-hmm. Be a Reformed classical theist. And you see it. He had the philosophical training, he had the theological training,
there's
the exegetical
no doubt.
Training.
Yeah.
And you see it in Edwards, you see it in Hodge, you see it in Turretin, you see it in Augustine. He was right in that line. And we just need that. And I think what you said was so instructive. You get that God is holy, you get who God is, that perfect ens perfectissimus, the most perfect being. Then the dominoes all fall in the right direction. Who we are, who Jesus is, the gospel, and really ECT and the controversy of the mid-90s is just an extension of that train of thought.
Inerrancy as well. There's extended a whole
Absolutely.
Chapter on that. Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Has everything to do with the nature of God. Yeah. That's I'd like to pull on that a little, investigate a little bit more, because this is something that I take away, from my own personal experience, and I'm being an OP guy, everything comes back to Machen always. And so we think about the need
he loved Machen, by
I know
the way.
he did. I know.
Yeah.
But we always have that narrative of that need to fight and to maintain orthodoxy, to fight the good fight of the faith. And R.C. understood that coming up in the UPC USA, and then eventually, his time at Pittsburgh and other things, and then becoming an ordained minister in the PCA. He was so concerned, even after he would pass on and move, after his time on this earth, to maintain confessional orthodoxy and conservatism, because he saw it time and time again, even faithful institutions, some of the world's best, Princeton Theological Seminary, in just a short amount of time, foregoing everything they stood for and going off in another direction. In your correspondence or time or just even researching Dr. Sproul, what can be said about that willingness to fight for the truth, and also just his insistence to maintain that orthodoxy when the world would want you to innovate and start doing all sorts of other things, make a name for yourself with some new ideas? He wanted to toe the line, but in the best of senses.
Absolutely. So I come back to some of the board meetings we had for RBC. This was, of course, college he founded in 2011.
Yeah, right.
And where I work. And we'd have these board meetings. And up until his passing, he was chairman of the board. He'd start off every board meeting with a half-hour narrative on exactly what you just talked about.
Really?
And he would talk about Princeton. And then he'd talk about Machen. And he would talk about theological fidelity. And it was very clear to all of us in the room, if this institution ever, even for a moment, entertains drift, the ghost of R.C. Sproul will make our lives miserable.
Right. And it should.
No, I look at what he did. The chairman of the board of Ligonier Ministries must be a trained theologian. Like he wrote all these interesting checks and balances into the institutions and organizations he was a part of, because the thing, like my number one charge as my role here at RBC is to govern theological fidelity. I'm to steward our theological fidelity. That's my number one charge. This is what he was all about. And you see church history is littered with apostasy. And and he did it by holding up scripture and by holding up examples of Luther and his boldness, Machen and his courage. That every chance he got, he spun that narrative.
And we find there are many people that are theologically conservative, willing to fight for the truth, maintain confessional orthodoxy, but there's something different when you are forged in a fire. And it's not to say that we should desire that for ourselves. Like, I wish I was born in a liberal church. No, nothing like that. But the historical circumstances of Dr. Sproul's life, in much the same way that Machen was formed and many others, it's hard to understand those types of things and to be willing to fight and do what it takes to maintain theological fidelity when you don't have those personal experiences.
The appreciation, yeah. I think it gave him two things. It gave him conviction. It's not enough to just have these beliefs. You've got to be ready to contend for these. So he's a convictional, confessional guy. I think it also gave him a real compassion for people.
Yes.
And those two often are not. They don't always get viewed as going together, but in RC they did. And he genuinely cared for people that they knew the truth, because that's the best thing for them, to know the truth. So I think it materialized in his life as a convictional, compassionate, conservative, Reformed classical theist. And I think that's what we all appreciated about him.
Yeah. Yes. I think we find in him a great example of loving militancy, which is sounds like it's paradoxical, but in Christ it's not. Yeah. That's great.
He was a kind man who stood for things.
Amen. Finishing the book, I should say, what's your lasting impression or any thoughts, anything that is abiding with you day to day now that you've had the time and Dr. Sproul's been gone for several years and you've written the book? What's still there? What do you wake up in the morning or when you're going to work thinking about as a kind of lasting significance?
Sure. I think three things. Number one, I was actually sad to finish the book because I was so enjoying being in his life.
Yeah.
and writing it. And so finishing it was sort of a disappointment for me. And I thought there's no way any other book I ever write is going to be nearly as much fun as this book. So I had that thought. But the second thought was, I've had so many people talk to me about the impact that RC had on them. And I think we need biographies today. I think we need stories of faithfulness. We need stories of conviction. This is a weird moment. I think of just how things have shifted since 2017 and RC's passing.
Yes.
What does the next year bring for us? I mean, we really need to be encouraged in our walk and in our faithfulness and our own courageous conviction as Christians. And so I just hope that this biography is used for people who appreciated RC, were impacted by him, but to be able to say, okay, I may not be in RC writing 100 books, especially pastors, I may not be in RC and be a platform speaker and all these people lamenting my death, etc. But I can be faithful where God has put me, and I must be faithful where God has put me. And I hope people get encouragement, whether they're in ministry or in a vocation, to just be a faithful, convictional Christian themselves, because that's really what our culture needs, and that's what our churches need.
Absolutely. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Nichols. Very thankful to him to take the opportunity to talk about these things. And of course, you can find out more information about this book at crossway.org and order it from a whole host of outlets online and in person. And you can head on over to ligonier.org as well to find out more information about the teaching ministry of Dr. Sproul. And check out Reformation Bible College. They've got a lot of interesting programs and things going on online as well. You can find them at reformationbiblecollege.org. That's where Dr. Nichols spends a good amount of his time. And you can register for conferences or even inquire about applying to send for you to go down there, or maybe inquiring on behalf of one of your children. A wonderful place to study. So we're online at reformedforum.org. There you'll find information about all of our programs and courses. We have several courses that are coming out in the near future that we're working on editing, as well as quite a few books, other publications that'll be out shortly. And the easiest way to stay in touch is just keep checking the website or subscribe to our email newsletter. You can do that on the website. But I do want to thank everybody for listening, and we hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.